All right, welcome everybody. So this is the nuts and bolts of a CI/CD with a large XPages and REST app. And if you read the description of the event, you may have been led to believe that this will actually show you how specifically you are supposed to do that. That was a filthy lie, and you've all been tricked. Instead, I realized as I was putting this together that was the intent. But I realized as I was putting this together that it's not really practical to do all of this in one presentation. So what I'm going to do is go over the various parts. So I will be talking about the nuts and the bolts, but it's really buckets of nuts and bolts of different categories that I will be talking about. So the things that go into this app, and the things that you wouldn't necessarily use all of them in every situation. I mean, in simpler situations, the answer is just NSF ODP tooling, and for that, I would say see my session from last year. But I'm going to discuss a lot of these things, and I have in the deck. It's also partially written for SlideShare. So in the deck, I have a bunch of links for each one to previous blog posts I've done, OpenNTF projects I'm using, non-OpenNTF projects I'm using, applicable videos, that sort of thing. So the hope is that it will be a good guide for working with this stuff, and it will at least point you in the directions for the things you'd like to do. I do hope to keep up with chat. I have that open, so if at any point if you have questions about things, if it's something I'll address later, I'll leave it. But if there's anything that ends up being not well enough explained or seems too out of left field, I will admit that I have been immersed in this stuff for years and years. I wrote a lot of these projects, so I'm a lot more familiar with them than people who are not me. So please let me know if there's anything you would like me to expand on as we go. So to start out with, as a brief bit of introduction, I'm Jesse Gallagher. I'm the CTO of a consulting company in Pennsylvania called I Know Some Guys. So we do consulting contracting like a great many of us in the community. I'm also the IP manager, and I need to update this. I'm now also the secretary at OpenNTF, thanks to the recent board election shifts. My blog there, frostedlink.us, is where I post a lot of these things. So I will periodically just talk about what I've been doing, show code, link to project, describe new things, and a lot of the links in this are back to my blog. It's a very self-reinforcing kind of presentation that way. And I am on Twitter at Gidgerby, so feel free to at me on there, basically. Before I properly begin, though, I would like to talk about the sponsors of this event. So, for all of us, it's free, and even when it was in person, it was a nominal fee at most, and that's because of the sponsors of CollabSphere. So, even though for a lot of us, we just walk over from our bedroom to the computer and we're good for the conference, it's not free. Like, it's not free to run this stuff. I mean, OpenNTF's been running webinars. We know it costs money to run webinars. And this is much larger than our one a month, and so that is it costs a lot, and this is how it happens. So thank all of these sponsors. That this is the reason that we can have this event, and this is the way it works. So I'm going to go over the moving parts. There are quite a few of these. So the app itself, it has a core set of OSGI plugins. Has an XPages library. It has JAX-RS based REST services. So if you've been doing this for a while, you may have used Wink, which ships with the extension library. Wink is very old and busted. We don't use that, but it's the same idea. Wink is an old implementation of JAX-RS, and so we have services in plugins. So we have those. We have a handful of compile time tests. We have some things. Compile time tests, as you'll see, are difficult with Domino, but we do have a handful that do some sanity checking, make sure all of our model objects make sense as far as can be done by a compile time test. We also now have NPM build-based JavaScript applications. So we have our XPages applications, we have our REST services, and then a lot of the newer modules of this are being written in Angular. So this includes an NPM-based build process, which is a separate thing that has to be done. Like with newer Angular, most newer JavaScript frameworks, you can't just save it and go. You have to have this build process, which means going out to NPM. And if you've worked with NPM, you know it is a nightmare. So that's part of the build process, unfortunately. But that's one of the things that has to come in. Some of these are delivered from OSGI. So in some cases, we take the app and we wrap it into one of the OSGI bundles, and then that's served as resources using the extension libraries mechanism for that. And so these are things that are in an XPages app embedded in an iframe. One of them is delivered via an NSF. So these are brought in as design elements inside an NSF during the build process. So the way it works is that we have the shell of the NSF in the repository, and then during the build, it not only builds the NPM-based app itself, but then copies all of those files into the NSF, and then that is essentially our distribution mechanism for it. That lets us do easier like ACL management, because then since they're design elements, we can handle who can access that sort of thing. So that's for one of them, we do that. And then we have a set of NSS. Some of them are XPages apps, most are Notes client apps. So this is a project that, like a lot of projects, existed for a while before XPages existed. It was all Notes client based. It still exists in that way for certain departments. It's gone through a couple revisions of XPages apps, and now it's going through a couple revisions of not XPages apps. And so this all still exists. And even the ones that aren't heavily used as client applications still contain the data. So they have all of our views that we need for backing all of this stuff. So we have, it's like 18, something like that. A lot of NSFs of varying complexity. Some of them are pretty small, some of them are very large. And then some of them are, there's like the core XPages app that has 200 some custom controls and a bunch of XPages and Java code that goes in and works with the OSGI plugins. And it's as complex as you could imagine an XPages app is going to get. Additionally, most of these are not properly run with source control. So we have our core team that does the Java stuff. We use Git heavily. We use branches. We use proper commits. Not everybody on the team does, because this is a Notes shop. So we just have to take this as part of life, that at some point there will be changes to the Notes client apps that we don't know about and are not handled in Git and do not show up as commits or features or issues in the tracking system. They just happen. And so this is essentially every once in a while a storm rolls through and we just have to deal with it. We also have a set of JEE web apps. So this will come into play later. These are not currently for production purposes. These are for local development. This is how I do my development in these apps. And these are also for our CI/CD servers. So they take the XPages application and one of the JavaScript applications and wrap them in WAR files. So JEE here is traditionally Java EE, now Jakarta EE. So it's really, web app stuff that runs in a Java web app server. So similar technology to XPages, but not run from Domino's HTTP stack. So we have the main XPages app, which was a fun one to get running in there, and then one of the JS apps. So we have those two. And then we also have a set of test containers based tests. And test containers is a mechanism for helping automated tests using Docker containers. So this is towards the end of the presentation. I'll talk about that. It's a great little project. It's hard to get it Domino to play, like with a lot of these things, it's hard to get Domino to play well with it, but I did, and it's neat. So the toolchain, Maven, for the last 1,000 years, I think I've been talking about Maven at MWLUG, and I'm going to do it again. This is the thing that runs the whole build process. Everything runs through Maven. It runs the core projects. It shells out to run the NPM builds. It runs the automated tests. This is the way that it happens. So all of the tool, like I've written a lot of tooling that works with Maven. A lot of the other stuff I'm just using existing tools. Everything goes through. This is the spine of the entire project repository. I use the Maven bundle plugin, which is a way of wrapping a Maven build with OSGI metadata. That is to say, manifest.mf. It doesn't write the plugin.xml, but mostly it's adding stuff to manifest.mf. It does some sanity checking for this. We used to use Tycho. If you've been following my blog for a while, I have a strong love-hate relationship with Tycho. It's better in some ways, it's worse in others. I think I linked to a couple blog posts about this. That itself, like the comparison of those two and how they work, is an actual project or an actual presentation topic that is way out of scope for this. I use Maven bundle plugin now because it lets me use third-party dependencies a little more easily. Tycho is actually getting a little better at that, but it's not quite the same. I use front-end Maven plugin. This is what allows me to, during a Maven build of all these Java and NSF projects, also build the NPM-based project. So it handles creating the NPM environment and doing the build. I use the NSF ODP tooling. So this is one of my projects at OpenNTF. This is what allows me to take an on-disk project of an NSF and turn it into an actual NSF while also compiling XPages stuff and keeping a sane environment. And so this is actually the project I'm talking about. Generally, this client project is why NSF ODP tooling exists, because I didn't want to have to do this otherwise. I usually use Eclipse. You could use IntelliJ. Sometimes I do. They have their pluses and minuses. VS Code is not quite as fleshed out for this stuff, but you also could. You could use VI if you want to. That's one of the nice things. You don't have to use Designer for much. NPM, again, via front-end Maven plugin. The reason I didn't make this one a link is out of protest because I don't like NPM. I use the XPages Jakarta EE support. So this is a project that I have, another one that I have on OpenNTF that adds newer JAX-RS, it adds CDI, it adds newer expression language, and a couple other things. And we use this heavily in this project to kind of do newer technology. So we have better bean validation, we have better REST services, we have better expression language support. So these are not necessarily required for doing the build, but we use them because it makes the app better. I use Open Liberty. So this is IBM's open source server derived from the good version of WebSphere. I love this. It is amazing. I use it for as much as I can. And this is how we do our containerized applications. This is how I do my local development. So this is the app server. If you like one of the others, Payara, Glassfish, what have you, they're all great. This is the one I happen to like. I use the XPages runtime project within that. So this is what allows me to run XPages applications basically fully outside of Domino. So not with OSGI, not with Domino, but I run the same exact XPages application with a couple tweaks inside a normal Java EE container, in this case, Open Liberty. And then I use test containers, which implies Docker. So these are all, when I upload the slides, these are all links to their respective technologies. Now, every explanation in this presentation comes with an implicit, but it gets more complicated in practice. So this is, as I was writing, that's where I realized that there was no way I could actually go over all of this in one presentation. So keep this in mind. I show little bits of code just to give you an idea, but it's always much more complicated in practice, unfortunately. So to start off with, Maven. I'll do a brief aside here. This is actually the same slide I had last year. Maven is not inherently scary. It always has seemed so. Just look at this owl. It's not a scary owl. It's a very cozy owl ready for winter. It's a tool for build automation. It's primarily used for Java projects, but it's adaptable to many things. You could do C, you could do whatever. We also do JavaScript with it. pom.xml file is the giveaway that you're working with a Maven project. So if you go to a repository and you see that, it's a Maven project. We use it here because it allows for reproducible builds across systems without environment-specific details. Admittedly, there's always a little bit of environment-specific detail, like Windows versus Linux matters. But in general, this allows much cleaner than, for example, if you were to ship around Eclipse project files, which tend to get very corrupted. So Maven is great, complicated. Now, because I'm going to talk about Maven, I will kind of burn through this slide much more quickly than I had originally intended. Tycho versus Maven bundle plugin. So Tycho is actually a derivation of Eclipse's plugin environment. So if you've done XPages library development, you will have used Eclipse's PDE plugin development environment. It's also what's present in Designer. So that's kind of the backbone of the OSGI environment there. Tycho is that at the Maven level. It prevents an OSGI environment very similar to Domino. It's the same Equinox container if you know your OSGI containers. It can strongly enforce expectations and dependencies. So it checks all of your manifests, it checks all your require bundle import package. It does all of that in a nice, useful way. And it has great support for doing test suites with notes environments because of the way it spawns a test container. But I switched the Maven bundle plugin for added flexibility. It makes it much easier to work with normal Maven dependencies, but it requires a lot more knowledge. Like I have to do a lot of manual tweaking of manifests and things like that I didn't necessarily, like you have to manually tweak it in Tycho, but you don't know in this case until it's already deployed. In part because Domino doesn't really play as well with OSGI stacks as others. So the compile step does not do as much validation. So this is a kind of, once you know what you're doing, you can feel free to do this, but I don't recommend it for everybody. There are other options. There's B&D Maven plugin. B&D is this whole tool chain that actually Maven bundle plugin uses. I don't know much about it. I'm not good enough at it yet, so maybe one day I'll do it. So I made a blog post a couple years ago. Here's kind of describing how I was moving from one to the other. Now, another quick thing with Maven, I also do OpenAPI generation. So this is known originally as Swagger. It creates a YAML or JSON file for your REST services. So because we use JAX-RS and because we have some annotations in there, we use the Swagger Maven plugin so that during every build, it creates this OpenAPI file that gets included with the build. And then the people working on the REST or the JavaScript apps that use the REST services now have an OpenAPI. They can use Swagger UI to view it. They can use other tools like IntelliJ has amazing support for importing this. And you can see all of this stuff. So it shows you what the parameters are, all of that. And this happens every build. So the Java code is canonical. And then during the build, we get this OpenAPI generated and is included with it. This is lovely. It saves us a lot of hassle of saying we made this change. Well, we still have to tell them if we made a change, but it saves us a lot of hassle of describing these are the parameters that are expected because now we have a spec that goes with every single build and it's official with the code that's actually in there. Now, I mentioned there's a lot that goes on here that is about taking this complicated project and getting it running in multiple scenarios. So we have the core parts of the app that target three main environments. We have XPages on Domino, which is an OSGI environment. We have servlets on Domino, which is an OSGI environment. So these are our JAX-RS resources. So if you've done work with this, you know that these are very similar environments, but they're not the same environment. You don't have the same beans. You don't have all the same stuff available. Like you don't have a faces context. The class exists, but the context does not. But then we also have war-based Jakarta EE projects that are not OSGI. So we can't rely on anything to do with OSGI. We can use it when appropriate, but we have to make sure that anything we're doing does not assume that's there. Like we can't assume any of the core stuff is started with OSGI. We can't assume that we have an extension manager with OSGI. So all of this has to know. So we can't make a lot of assumptions at all. Like, and then you can see in the screenshot, there are also test runtimes that may or may not be OSGI. There's the SWT environment, which is actually used in Eclipse if we run stuff in there. There's notes environment. There's all these different things that all have slightly either small or major differences. So we use a runtime environment type to handle differences. So this says, get me a session, get me the current servlet request, get me log this error, do whatever you need to do. So the interface is very clean. And then each target has an implementation that does the dirty work. So the core code will just say get session and it works anywhere. So in XPages, it'll do like xlibutil get current session. In OSGI servlets, it'll say context info, get current session. In a Jakarta EE app, it will get the one from a filter that I made. It gets fiddly. Error handling is weird. Detecting the right runtime is weird. There are a lot of little things, like you have to make sure your code correctly identifies what the runtime is. But this does allow us to say, this is something that's different per platform, but we only want to say, I just want the environment to do X, and then every single environment can implement it differently. We also have to worry about balancing dependencies. Maven bundle plugin makes third-party dependencies easier, but Domino still makes it hard. Some dependencies need to be repackaged for Domino's OSGI environment. I have a link to the Jakarta EE project's repackaging, where it will change the dependencies in between them, because a lot of the core XPages projects will have older versions of things that I need, but it won't have versions on them, so I have to bind directly. There's a lot of crappy stuff in the notes class loader lately that will break all sorts of things, and it's just getting worse. So I have to take a lot of care for this. Yeah, some are safest to avoid. Like, we've started moving away from Guava entirely because that's included in the Domino class path, and it will just change versions arbitrarily. And because it's not an OSGI, we have no version management of it. So we just decided, you know what, we're not going to use Guava, which is a shame because Guava is great. It's very handy. There's a reason why HCO wants to use it. There's not a reason why it's present in the class path. So here's a link to my blog post about the runtime environment idiom. This goes into a little more detail, similar to what I was just talking about how we do that, and why it's useful, what it gets us. Now to talk about the NPM-based builds in Maven. So this is where we have other projects outside of the main tree. It's in the same repository, but outside of the main tree where other developers will work on JavaScript-based projects. They use VS Code, they use local test stuff. And then we just want to run the builds during the Java project build so that they're included in there without having to make them worry about the Java project tree. They don't have to go 10 layers deep into the Maven projects. So we use the front-end Maven plugin. So this allows you to run various front-end tools, so NPM, Yarn, Webpack, etc., based on configuration in the Maven POM. So if you have any of these, it's probably supported in this project. It's wonderful. We have the JavaScript apps in a separate directory away from Java. So we have the plugin directory that has all of the NSFs and the OSGI plugins and the web apps and all that stuff that has all the Java code. And then next to that is the JavaScript code. So they don't have to worry about it. The build config specifies node and NPM versions and the target directory. So what it says is we're going to build this using node version, whatever, NPM version, whatever, and our workspace, effectively like the project we're building, is go a couple layers up and then work with this one. So one project copies the results into an OSGI plugin, another copies them into an NSF during the build. The process is basically the same though. So you have a couple steps where you'll have an execution of the plugin that says install node and npm, which makes sure that in your local work, Scratch environment for the project, it will have the version of node and npm that you specify. This is actually a really nice feature because it's very easy to, in your local dev environment, just kind of willy-nilly update node, which admittedly does break build sometimes when they don't tell us that they upgraded node for the project, but it's nice to have it consistent. So you're working with this and it's not going to just shift randomly, other than humans doing it. Then it does an npm install just to make sure that the dependencies are installed, and then it does the run build, which is the configured script for running the Angular build. And so this will do as if you were sitting there with, in a terminal and you did npm install and npm run build. So this executes these, but it handles all the differences about what platform it's running on. It'll work on Windows and Linux and Mac OS, and it'll put it all in a Scratch directory. And then when it's done, it's all clean and you don't have to worry about contaminating anything else. So it does a wonderful job of making NPM, which is notoriously difficult to reproduce, a little more reproducible. So here's some links here. I have one that's just the project page, and then another one that describes a feature that I added to the JSF ODP tooling that allows you to say, include this directory wholesale in as web content resources. So that's what I do in the NSF, where I say I built the built the JS app with NPM, and now I just want to take index.html, the JS files, CSS, all that stuff, and then copy it in as web content resources during the build. So that way, the ODP can be just the skeleton that we need that handles the ACL and the landing page to redirect and all that sort of thing. But then it brings in all the resources as we go. Now, I mentioned this a couple of times, and I will just never stop talking about this because I use it constantly. So this is the glue that handles working with NSF. So this is what compiles ODPs to NSF. This is what updates ODPs for server-side changes outside of Git. So those are the projects I talked about where the changes do not happen in Git, but we still have to account for them. And it has some niceties in Eclipse where you get DXL and XSV autocomplete. So since I do a lot of XPages development inside Eclipse, while I never use the design view in Designer, I still do like having some autocomplete. I like to know what the properties are. And so having this autocomplete helps quite a bit. So the compilation step happens. So this is output during a Maven build where it will use a fresh build of the OSGI plugins each time. So this is a big thing that can easily happen where if you have it in XPages library, you develop it in Eclipse and then you install it on the server, you didn't notice that you broke something in your NSF because you were calling a method and then you deleted that method or renamed it or whatever. So because these are part of the same build and also they're both present in Eclipse, I can see that. If I change it in the library in Eclipse, it will also change in the NSF. But even if I didn't have the NSF, the build would break because it would say, oh, you're trying to call a method that doesn't exist anymore. So this is a nice sanity check step in addition to handling the process of creating the NSF for me. This is a good step. So it runs in a local Equinox environment. So it has, effectively a full XPages environment as far as the compilation area goes. So it's very similar to compiling in Designer, which it has to be, or else it wouldn't work. So you can see here it's starting up the OpenNTF Domino API because that happens in an activator. So that starts up during the process of installing the library. If you have, POI for XPages or any number of other XPages libraries, those will just work as they are, and they'll get compiled in. So we have our custom ones, we have our OpenNTF ones. And then it also has some nice things, like it sets the $template field or template build shared field. So this way the NSF will say, this is the version coming from Maven, and this is the timestamp of when it was built. So we always know which version of the NSF or the NTF is deployed currently. So we have that mechanism of seeing this is when it was done, which I feel is kind of nice. And since it ties into the Maven version, you can handle it with Maven versioning stuff, and you don't have to worry about manually tweaking the template build, the shared field with like an agent or something like you would otherwise have to. This also allows us to pull in the changes. So we have in each database that we're going to update from the server, we have the database path of the canonical version of that. So this is the one where when that changes, we want to update the ODP as opposed to vice versa. So each one will have, it goes to this server and this is the path to it. Ideally, again, all of the changes will be happening in source control, but this is a nice second best option to do this. And then we have a script in there that this is, a lot of this is just kind of bash Linuxy nonsense. But what this is doing is saying for all the projects here that are not known ones that are handled in source control. So we know that, dashboard and plans here are handled in source control. We don't need to update those. And in fact, it would be very damaging to do so. For all of those, run the generate ODP task from the Maven plugin. So what this will do is it'll say whatever projects are in here, update those from the remote server. So every time we're doing a major version of the app, I will go through and say, I'm going to update the on-disk projects for whatever their current state is. And then I just run this script, let it do its thing, make sure the changes look good, check them in, and then there we go. So this is something I just do periodically, unfortunately. And then I mentioned the XML autocomplete. So this is meant to provide good enough XML autocomplete for XSP. I had it generate from the XPages controls that exist on the server. So this is kind of there's a script that I have that generates a XML schema out of this. And so then you get this kind of built-in support in the XML editor that Eclipse uses. And then similarly, the DXL files, Domino actually ships with pretty good DXL schemas and has for a long time. Like DXL is pretty good in a lot of ways. And one of them is that it ships with DTTs and schema files, and they're legally redistributable. So I grab those, put them in here. And so when you're editing DXL, you also get verification that your DXL is legal. It will show you like if there's a multiple choice kind of field, like field type or something like that, it will show you the options and it will yell at you if you pick an incorrect one. So you kind of just get some niceties when dealing with XML. And, a lot of us deal with XML all the time, and so it's not too uncomfortable. And having these tools helps quite a bit. And so here I have a bunch of NSF ODP links. The last one is my session from last year at CollabSphere. So if you didn't see that one, I'd say check that out because that's all about NSF ODP. Basically everything from that will still apply. Now the XPages Jakarta EE support project. This is another one of my very functionally named projects. So what this is it's effectively like a platform update for the app for XPages. So it brings in a number of newer technologies that some of which exist in XPages somewhere in the stack and some of which don't. But for example, it brings in EL3. So there's the expression language in XPages that's like effectively like EL 0.5, like it was before it became unified EL. So the way that worked is that I think it was originally made for JSF and then it became its own standard. And if you've ever been in a situation where you say, can I pass arguments to a function in EL? And you ask, and somebody says in XPages you cannot. In EL3 you can. So part of this project is that you can now use this in XPages and you can pass arguments to functions. So it's a lot of little things like that. There's it's this one, none of these are like night and day, but they're very handy. And so there's, I also added JAX-RS 2.1. The idea of this is the same. So JAX-RS is the thing where if you're writing a REST service, you do @path to show what the path is, and you do @get to annotate a method that says it'll call this. And then the one that's in Wink with the extension library is like JAX-RS 1, I think. And then 2.1 is much newer, not dramatically different. It's not incompatible, but it is nicer. And there's some newer things you can do with better parameter handling, better data type handling, better extensibility. It also brings in CDI, which is 10 presentations worth of content on its own. CDI, the quick and dirty version, is that it's like managed beans, but better. There's a lot that goes into that as far as injecting. If you've used Spring, if you saw in Slobodan's presentation, I believe yesterday, maybe it was the day before, he would use @AutoWired to say, just give me the implementation of whatever. CDI does that on the Jakarta side. So that's where you can say, give me the current servlet context without having to look up for it. This is not required for the CI CD part. I just like it, and it just makes things a lot nicer. So for example, here's one of the resources we have that kind of uses all of this. So because we're using newer JAX-RS and integrating it with other technologies, we can say, okay, @path is pretty normal, but now we can say @permit all, which means that this JAX-RS resource is essentially anonymous allowed, whereas most of them are not. And then we have the handler coming in that will say, I can read that annotation. That's part of it's like the Jakarta security spec or something or other. It might be part of annotation. There's a bunch of specs, but that's one of the standard specs. And then we could read that and say, this one's allowed even when all the others are not. And then you can see here @inject server info. Server info is a class that we have, but we have a managed bean in CDI that will say, I can provide server info. So for our app purposes, this will be things like the login, logout URL, things like that, which goes along with the runtime environment. Where on Domino, login URL is one thing, on Liberty, it's another thing. And here we can just say @inject, and it will handle the job of saying, effectively, there's a server info managed bean out there, and this will put this in here. So you don't need to do a variable lookup. You don't need to do a manual lookup. You can just say, inject this here. And then this could be coming from a configured bean. It could be coming from a method that produces an object. It could be any number of things. You also see here the @get and @produces. These are JAX-RS things saying, when you do a GET request to this URL, it will produce JSON. But then the @tag and @operation come back in with the OpenAPI specification. So these are things to do with, these are Swagger UI annotate, well, not Swagger UI, Swagger documentation annotation. So we have these in here, and then we can say, we're going to tag this with this. We're going to provide some extra operation information. If we had arguments, you'd be able to document those and provide descriptions and examples and things like that. And then these annotations are pulled in during the OpenAPI generation, so that when we're built, we end up having a server info resource, and we can say that it's in the external portal category, and it has this summary, and then the description is actually filled in the app, and we can have other stuff. And so it's part of the human readable documentation, and then we just write it in this method. And then because we have also bound in our JAX-RS service, we don't have to manually create JSON. We just say return some Java object, and then it gets returned, and then it's turned into JSON because it knows, oh, I'm returning JSON. I got a Java object. I also have a JSON interpreter. I will create this. So these are all these things where it's like, you can do all this stuff currently. Like technically you can do all this stuff in LotusScript if you wanted to, but like this is all just, we have annotations. It's easier to read once you know, especially. You can just see what's going on, and you're more declaring what you're intending to do rather than writing all of this boilerplate code that would say, I need to take a server info object and then do a JSON writer or make a map and output whatever. So it just ends up being much cleaner and more condensed code. And the result of that is that, if we update to a newer version, it will get capabilities without us having to write that. We can swap to different implementations and all sorts of things. So I have some links here. These are blog posts of mine and to the project itself, describing what the project is, what the intent is, where the current version is, where the development happens. Now, XPages outside Domino. This one's fun. So I once again functionally called it the XPages runtime project. So this is an open source project that allows running XPages in a normal servlet container. I've only ever run it in Liberty. It should work elsewhere. It should work in, in Tomcat or Glassfish or whatever. There's nothing in particular in the code that assumes you're running in any given environment other than Servlet 4. So it should work elsewhere, but I've only ever tested it in the one. It turned out that when I was working on this, all the stuff from XPages life before it was packaged in OSGI is still there. So all the core stuff is written for web app containers. Like it ran on WebSphere originally, and I assume it ran on Tomcat. That's all still in there because it's still useful code, no reason to get rid of it, I suppose. It does require some tweaks with third-party libraries and some of the newer stuff, as in newer extension library things that did start to assume it was in OSGI. So if something does assume it's in OSGI, I take some tweaks for third-party libraries, and a couple of them, like I updated ODA to work without any further tweaks, that sort of thing. And you just have to make sure your code doesn't assume that you're in an OSGI environment. It's very easy to let those things sneak in there. Some things I've added some hooks to help out with, like with activators and things like that. But I also did have to tweak a couple things to make sure that they weren't assuming that it would have all sorts of Eclipse classes. And well, classes are available, but the environment is not. But what this gets us is that we can have CI deployment servers and full automated tests that are not running full Domino servers. In theory, you could do them with full Domino servers too with the Docker container, but I don't, and that has its own extra hassle stuff to go along with it. So the runtime has some shim code that handles bootstrapping ODA, other libraries. The JAX-RS services use Liberty's built-in support. So for example, on Domino in the Jakarta EE project, I use a implementation called REST Easy. And that works fine, but Liberty brings its own, which I think is Apache CXF, but it also doesn't matter because I just say enable JAX-RS, and then the web app will say, great, I have JAX-RS services, I will use whatever is present, and then in this case, the container provides it. The web app project uses symlinks on the file system, which also work on Windows, to point to the ODP for XPages, Java, etc. So like this is essentially a web app version of the main XPages NSF. And then you can see we have the controls and themes in XPages, and those are just links to the equivalent files in the ODP. So if an XPage changes in the NSF, it will change in here and vice versa. So that way we don't have to worry about copying XPages or controls or anything around. Like there are some files that are distinct, like basis config, which almost never changes, but it uses the same Java code, it uses the same XPages and so forth. And so that way, this is essentially just an alternate way to work with the same exact code in the repository. And so I've mentioned before, this is how I do my XPages development. And it works in this web app. So there are some tweaks, like I was saying, don't make assumptions about OSGI. This is the second reason where the runtime environment Idiom came along. So originally it was XPages and servlet container, and now it's also in OSGI servlets, and then now it's a non-OSGI environment. IBM Commons has the extension manager, which fortunately XPages uses heavily. It accounts for this. It has special support for Eclipse and non-Eclipse, so you have to do a couple of tweaks. You also no longer have to bring along your own implementation for if you're using a JEE server. And then on Liberty, you just have to make sure you don't enable the JSF or JSP features because they will conflict with XPages. I mentioned here's how I do my initialization of the database. So when you're loading up this app, unlike in an NSF, there's no context. Like it doesn't know what database it's working with because it's just a web app, it's not an NSF. So in an NSF, you'll have session and session assigner and database that are all based on your context. Like you have logged into Domino and you are working with an NSF and you have these environments. So here we just have an environment variable that says this is the path to the database locally, or in a lot of these cases on a remote server. So I have my dev Domino server, and then locally I just say point to that for database. It populates the environment variables, and then it has a variable resolver that will say, if you're asking for session, get this native session. If you're asking for database, get the database object that was created. And so this handles all that, the papering over those differences where we create these during the request. This is all stuff that happens in the XPages runtime on Domino normally. I'm just essentially reproducing the same thing. So for this, here are the links for this. So it's the Open Liberty page itself. And then also a couple of blog posts, one where I was saying how this is a crazy thing that I'm doing that will probably never be used in real life. And then third link is the link to the project that I use in real life every single day, because it turns out it's actually extremely useful and very practical. Now, containerized XPages apps. So I take the web app version of it, and then I use the Open Liberty Docker container. So this is how I run CI/CD servers. So I take the notes runtime parts of the Docker images. So I download the ones from FlexNet. I copy over the program directory from that. I copy over some of the data stuff, and then I run the war. And so the war file, it will have an environment pointing to a dev domino server that we have for this purpose. And then I launch the container, and then I have this XPages app running. It will be pointing at domino data elsewhere because I fed it a server ID, I fed it a notes INI, so it knows how to do the notes client initialization. And so I have a couple of these. I have one that deploys that I call develop. There's one for release candidate branches. There's one for the current main branch. And so with this, I can have multiple containers, and they all point to where they're supposed to point data-wise. And this is using the official container plus the Open Liberty image. This is an example of the Docker file I'm using, where I'm talking about how I grab the war file that I built during the application build. I grab the notes runtime out of the domino container. Basically, I just harvest it for parts. And then I set up some environment variables so that notes can initialize properly. So links for that are here. So it started out as just a lot of these. They start out with, here's me experimenting with something. And then later I talk about how this is what I do every day for work purposes. And then I also have a blog post for how to do a full build in Docker, which is another nice way to do this. So for example, if you have Jenkins, you could have a full build of your entire application running in Docker so that it's all the more reproducible. So I have scripts in the repository for anybody, as long as you have Docker and the Domino image, you can do a full build of it regardless of whatever else you have installed, which is very, very handy because, as you know, even if you have a pretty clean project, it's very easy to run into cases where developers don't have X, Y, or Z, or, oh, their Maven version is too old, oh, their Java version is too old, or their NPM version isn't right, or whatever. And so having all of this stuff done in containers is all the better for reproducibility. And now finally, I'm going to do a whirlwind view of test containers. And so this is a project, not an OpenAPI project, that lets you handle creating containers to run apps and backend services. So a lot of the times test containers will create, for example, like a Postgres SQL database just for the test purpose. Obviously, we're not using Postgres here, but the idea is that there's common container things you can do just to spin up for the test, so you don't have to run a Postgres server somewhere else, and it will handle creating it and destroying it. Here, I use it to run the app as a container. Since I realized I already have it containerized, I could just run that as a container during the test and then do calls against it. So once you have all this containerized and you have Docker, you just need a little patience. You can do it. You can go much further than I have. So all I do so far is I'll skip to this. I just have some tests that will say, get the index.xsp page, make sure the title is what I think, and then it does some things like making sure that all the style sheet references work and aren't 404s, make sure all the JavaScript references work and aren't 404s. And you can do more stuff, like because I'm running this with containerized versions of Firefox and Chrome, I could do actual UI testing. Like I could have UI scripts that run in this, and this is running against an XPages application in a container that will be the same every single time I run it. So it allows me to have this sort of thing running against the real code without having to do stuff. I mean, technically, since it's accessing Domino data, but not running on Domino, so it's not quite true to production, but it's not too far off. It's very, very close, and closer than you would normally get with Domino. So I have basically the process for how to do this in the blog post that I eventually link to. I have links to this. I have an example from the Open Liberty blog where they're talking about doing this. And then here in my blog post, I describe here is how I was doing it. I have some more examples of code. Here's how I actually like bootstrap all of the stuff. And then I talk about how I added Selenium-based browser tests to the test container setup. So this Selenium being the tool that lets you run headless browsers. So I'm running Chromium and Firefox, so I run the same test with each browser to make sure it works. And you can also run, there's a pure Java native one that you can do, but if you have containers, then you can do these other ones, and it works really, really nicely. And then, because Selenium can be kind of a nightmare if you don't have Docker, but now that they're all Dockerized, it's wonderful. So I feel like that was probably kind of a whirlwind. I did warn you at the start, but are there any questions about this? So I covered quite a bit, and I feel like basically every section of this does warrant further expansion in blog posts or further presentations. And what it comes down to is that this is an extremely complicated topic. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. Domino fights you every step of the way. The tooling is not on Maven Central. It all assumes stuff about Domino. That you have to have a native notes runtime, which means you can only run on X platforms, and you have to worry about creating that and having a server ID. It's all very hostile to all of this, which is why I've done all of this work, which is why I have all of these projects. And so, it does work. It's very, very complicated, but eventually it does get to work. This is a good question. How many people in your organization are able to work on the whole picture in case you get run over by a bus? That's what Docker is for. Currently, they don't work on it, but they don't have any excuse not to. I wrote this stuff down. I have Docker containers and scripts to run it. In theory, they should be able to do it. All of the projects are open source. My documentation isn't always the best, but it's all open source. It's all containerized. So in theory, anybody can run the entire build. They can launch a server. I have scripts for all of this. The intent is that if I do get run over by a bus, while it would take some work just because there are a lot of moving parts, at least it should be reproducible at my funeral if they wanted to. So admittedly, this does get complicated and very specific to me, but a lot of the work I do is not just trying to build up this tooling, but then also make it so that it is explicable and reproducible. And I have scripts to say, like, if you need to do a full build, run this script. If you need to update the on this project, run this script. So the intent is that it doesn't rely on entirely just me. Admittedly, that is always very difficult to convey, especially if it is this giant sprawling thing where I'm the primary committer to the projects. But the intent is to get to the point where it's more and more explicable and reproducible. So good question. Tough to do. I try, but with probably mixed success. And with that, looks like we're actually over time. So thank you everybody for attending. I'm thinking maybe much like last year, probably next month, I'll do another presentation on myself on something or other, because I always, after one of these, I get in the mood for doing another one of these. So hopefully I'll do that. And then if I have, maybe that'll just be a sequel to this, because I feel like there's a lot more detail I can go into. It's extremely complicated. But now, before I get booted out, I will end the presentation. So thank you again, everybody, for joining me.